And they have, in the test, a kind of a line to see where you are. And you kind of got above the line, you know, kind of angry at all times. And below, way below the line, you've got kind of got, you know, incredibly laid back and kind of horizontal and placid and that kind of thing. And they talk about people then, they talk about, you know, that are so placid and then people, something will set them off, and they talk about, they will flip. And they go from that kind of placid, laid back, and they flip to the other side to anger. We had a great RE teacher who, Di Bible, it's a great name, isn't it, for an RE teacher? Di Bible. And he was just a great guy, and very laid back, very good teacher, very calm. And every class, it seemed, always tried to kind of wind him up and to be basically horrible to him, and he would stay placid. And kind of once a year, he would flip over and would kind of lose his temper, and kind of all the naughty boys would think they'd won, you know, again for the year. He would flip. In other words, he would go from almost kind of one extreme and go right to the other side. Because there are things like that which change everything. Everything is reversed or flipped. We've got a passage tonight in Matthew chapter 16. Everything flips. Everything is changed. Everything. We're going to look at that from verses 13 on this evening in Matthew chapter 16. Sometimes you can watch an interview on TV, often breakfast time, particularly when Piers Morgan used to be on whatever GMTV is now, Good Morning Britain or whatever it's called now, TVA, I'm showing my age, and like TVAM, whatever it is. But he would be on, and often he would interview someone that he would disagree with, and it wouldn't really be an interview. He would basically just tell them they're wrong, and every time they kind of open their mouths, they wouldn't really get anywhere, and it wasn't a proper interview. And there's kind of a style, isn't there, where they're basically, you're kind of not really interviewed, you're just told you're wrong, and you can't get a word in. Imagine, for a moment, a preacher of the gospel who's challenged his locality because of some moral issue, whatever it is in the area, but some big issue has occurred, morality-wise, and the local preacher has got involved and has made a stand, and perhaps it's got into the paper. And so this preacher gets invited onto breakfast TV. And the interview actually goes really well. And it's a proper interview, it's not just shouted at. And the preacher argues very well and kind of wins his case. And does it so well that he's invited back onto different TV programs. And he's there to give the kind of the Christian viewpoint on things, and he becomes more and more famous and more successful on TV. And eventually he is so successful, so well known, he even gets on Strictly or something like that. And you may think, that's wonderful. A preacher of the gospel and rising to influence and success. Is that good for the gospel? Imagine another preacher, same thing, perhaps a different area, different moral issue, whatever it is. And again, he's in the paper for standing up against this moral issue. On TV he goes, and breakfast TV, this time on the other channel, whatever. And there he's made mincemeat of. And he's ridiculed for his Christian faith. He's mocked, almost pitied. Actually, he is pitied. He'll never be invited back on TV. And the world says it's failure. Where is the success? Is it the one who's back on TV all the time? The personality, perhaps? Wins the argument? Perhaps. Or is it the loser? Who is displaying Christ-like behavior the most? Is one successful and one a failure? What flips and changes everything? Well, the world says, obviously, the one who's on Strictly or whatever, the one who's now appearing all the time is successful. And the other one who was made mincemeat of, the one who was crucified on TV, surely that's the failure. But hang on a minute. Let's flip this. You see, he's been, we would say, crucified on TV. Isn't that the Christian way? What is success as a Christian? What's the way of Jesus? The last 2 Sunday mornings, Phil has started a new series on 1 Corinthians. Again, plug that book. Take one if you haven't got one yet. That free book. But 1 Corinthians, the series has started. And in the next few weeks, I'm sure Phil will be moving on to that passage about the wisdom of God and the power of God. And Paul in 1 Corinthians tells us what the power and the wisdom of God really looks like. What does it look like? What is wisdom? It's not the wisdom of the world. That's not the wisdom of the world. What is it? It's Christ crucified. That is the power of God, and that is the wisdom of God. To the world, Paul says, it's foolishness and weak. And yet God flips everything, doesn't he? It's the complete opposite of what you would expect. That's what Paul's argument is to the Corinthians. He is saying, what does God's wisdom look like? What does God's power look like? It looks like his Son, the eternal Son, being executed on a cross. That's God's power, Paul says. That's God's wisdom. And the power of God and the wisdom of God and the cross of Christ inverts and flips and changes everything. The world says it's foolish and weak. God says, no, no, no. This is wise and powerful. And we see this with this passage tonight. We see this literally. Perhaps not literally, that's the wrong use of the word literally, but we see it being flipped and changed. We see when Jesus speaks that he changes everything. Peter, in the conversation that Jesus has, it's a remarkable conversation. It really is. Peter, as we read, the crowds, who to say the Son of Man is, in other words, who does people say I am? Well, some are saying Elijah, some are John the Baptist, resurrected. All those kinds of things. The crowds have got all different things. What about you? And Peter knows who Jesus is. He gets the identity of Jesus. You're the Son of God. You're the Messiah. You're the longed for one. You're the anointed one. You're the Christ. That's who you are. Blessed are you. God has revealed this to you, Peter. And those verses going on then about salvation and about Peter and the rock and Peter's confession and everything else. Only a couple of verses later, after Peter's really declaring that Jesus is the Messiah, we read about Jesus talking about what's going to happen to him. Peter gets who he is. Now Jesus is talking about his mission, what he's going to do. Verse 21 of Matthew 16. Jesus began to explain. He's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, teachers of the law. He must be killed, on the third day raised to life. Imagine being a disciple. Imagine being Peter. I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. When Jesus then says, we're going to go to Jerusalem, what are you thinking? Peter takes him aside, began to rebuke him. Tell him off. Never, Lord, he said. This will never happen to you. You've just said he's the Messiah. He understands who Jesus is. Now Jesus talks about suffering and dying. Peter has a human response. Don't suffer and die, Jesus. At the very least, you're our friend. You're our teacher. I've just said you're the Messiah. I get who you are. We don't want you to suffer. Of course we don't. And if you were there, of course you wouldn't. He's your friend. He's your master. He's the one that you've been following. He's the one that you've been watching. He's the one that you've been listening to. He's the one that you've seen do all these miracles. You don't want him to suffer and to die. Of course you don't. Peter is thinking humanly, isn't he? He has, as Jesus puts it, human concerns. Jesus says, this is how blunt it is, this is how flipped it is on its head, that is satanic. You don't want me to suffer. That's human thinking, which is satanic. How direct is that from Jesus? You have not the mind of the concerns of God, but you've got human concerns. That's satanic. You're not thinking of God, you're thinking of yourself, and you're thinking of me, humanly speaking, but it's satanic. Get behind me, Satan. It's a remarkable thing, isn't it? I want you to be comfortable, Jesus. Satanic, worldly. I want you to have success, Jesus. Worldly, satanic. God's thinking, Jesus' thinking, is the way of the cross. But it's shocking, isn't it? It really is shocking. Peter seemingly is thinking and caring of Jesus. That is worldly, says Jesus. Why? Because it's the way of the cross, says Jesus, for me. But here's something even more shocking. Verse 24. It's the same for you and for me as well. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. See, the cross flips and changes everything. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? You sometimes hear a conversation, don't you, between two people. One of them complaining perhaps about their arthritis, the other complaining about their child, son, daughter, whatever. They never phone. Oh, my hands are hurting, my joints, and everything else. And how do they... Well, we've all got our crosses to bear. That's about the only time we kind of use that phrase, really, in the world's kind of way. And we talk about and use that phrase as about the problems of life, the pains and the sufferings and the struggles. Yeah, we've all got our crosses to bear. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus is not talking about worldly problems in that way or health issues. Jesus is raising the bar far higher. To be a follower of Jesus is not about having a little bit of help to go through the problems of life. To be a follower of Jesus is not a kind of a bit of religion on a Sunday. It's not a little bit of church or a little bit of singing hymns and a little bit of reading the word and a little bit of praying. It's not about winning arguments, being successful on TV. The way of Jesus is the way of the cross. It changes everything. And anything else Jesus is saying here is worldly thinking. Do you really want to be a follower of Jesus tonight? Because there is a cost. We often say, don't we, well, it's free. It doesn't cost you anything to come to God, to come to the Lord Jesus. Well, it does according to Jesus. The cost is enormous. In fact, the cost is everything. Deny yourself, go and die to self, and perhaps this world. And the alternative is to gain the world. Well, let's have a look then, and just ask three very simple questions tonight. First is this. If you want to follow Jesus, the question to ask is, will it cost me my life? Does it really cost me my life to follow Jesus? And the simple answer is, yes, it does. And the key to understanding what Jesus is talking about here is to look at the words that he uses. Verse 24. Whoever wants to be my disciple, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, they must, not sometimes, not perhaps, you must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Those two things, deny yourself and take up your cross. Got to deny yourself. Things that are legitimate perhaps, but worldly, you deny yourself and take up your cross. And Now, we know what it means, don't we, to deny ourselves. There are times in life, aren't there, where you go through a diet or something like that, and you've got kind of legitimate food, but the diet says you don't eat this, you just eat cabbage soup or whatever it is. And so you eat this and you deny yourself, a biscuit or cake or potatoes or whatever, and you deny yourself. You could eat them, but you're going to deny yourself. You're not going to do that. You want to, but you deny yourself. So we know what that is. Jesus says we deny ourselves. We don't do what we want to do. We do what he wants us to do. Not my will be done, the Lord's Prayer, but your will be done. Your will be done. And that's really what Jesus is talking about here. We are denying ourselves, and instead of doing what we want to do when we want to do it, where we want to do it, we do what Christ wants us to do, when he wants us to do it. We're following him. But we're following him all the way, Jesus says. We deny ourselves and take up the cross. Their cross. Not his cross. Take up their cross and follow me. What's that mean? What does Jesus mean by taking up the cross? Is that the problems in life that we have to bear, like arthritis or health problems or whatever it is? No, that's not what Jesus means at all. Remember the context in which Jesus is speaking. He's speaking in the world of the Roman Empire, the world of execution, the world of Romans putting people on the cross to crucify them, literally on that cross. And if you see someone in a Roman colony or in the Roman Empire, if you see someone walking with a cross in their back, you know where they're going. They're going to their death. They're going to their own execution. They're going to die. That's where they're going. That's death. That's what Jesus means. March into their death. You take up your cross. You're dying to self, completely dying to self, and you're following me. It's the way of the cross. It changes everything. I remember many years ago, a preacher friend of mine who was working for UCCF, doing university mission one week, and I was asking him what he was preaching on. And I'd kind of grown up in a church, kind of an old gospel hall, evangelist, always kind of the gospel, selling the gospel. You must turn to Jesus. And what are you preaching on? Well, he said, it's the Thursday night, so we're counting the cost. What do you mean? So we're preaching tonight on what it means to be a Christian. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross. I was saying to him, why on earth would you do that? I thought you're trying to get people to become Christian, not put them off. What are you doing? And he said to me, he looked at me as if I had two heads, He said, well, that's part of the gospel. You don't just add Jesus to your life, there's a cost. The cost is huge. The cost is everything. Learned a lesson that day. I was shocked. Why would you do that? Because that's the gospel. That's the call of Jesus. Yes, to know Christ as your Saviour, but it's to have him as your Lord as well at all times, in all ways, in every part of your life. What is it? He is number one. And we deny ourselves, and the cost is everything. Yeah, we want salvation to be free. Peter wants it to be free, but that's worldly thinking. We're trying to ignore the cost. We kind of saw it a little bit last week. Remember, we were looking at Jephthah in Judges 11. He was asked, wasn't he, will you be our leader in battle? And he comes back to them, well, I will, but hang on a minute. If I'm going to go into battle for you, I want to be your Lord as well. I'm willing to pay the cost, but I've got to be your Lord. You can't just have me as your soldier for free. There's a cost here. Jesus comes to you as Saviour and Lord, and the way is the way of the cross. And the way of the cross was the way of the cross for him, and it is for him and for his followers as well. We are to follow him where he goes, which means the cross. And it means that if he really is your Lord, then you obey him, don't you? the Lord's Prayer. Your will be done. Is that the way that you think? Are you willing to pay the cost? Well, the second question that we ask is this. Well, what does the alternative look like? You say, I see the cost. I see that it's everything. I see that it's everything that I have, everything that I am. I see that it's the whole thing. So what's the alternative? Well, Jesus gives us the alternative. Verse 26 rather. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their own soul? Jesus says, potentially, you could gain the whole world. You could. I mean, nobody ever does. And the world promises everything, doesn't it? But it doesn't fulfill. I mean, you've only got to open your newspapers and there are adverts saying, have this and your life will be fulfilled. This is the product you always wanted. You just never knew. Your TV screens are full of adverts, even when we try to fast forward them. The TV program will be sponsored by someone, giving you the product that you never thought you needed, but how can you possibly live without that? The world offers you everything, and you can have it all. But it doesn't last, does it? Just doesn't last at all. I mean, we read great stories of history of those who have great, vast wealth and nations and power and everything else, but they're now just bylines in history. Just forgotten people. It said that one of the old emperors, Charlemagne, was buried, and when they found his bones, his finger was pointing to the text. What will it be to profit? What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Who's Charlemagne? Exactly. Just forgotten now, isn't he? And that's the point. Even if you have the whole world, what do? We keep building bigger barns. That's the picture Jesus gives. This time next year we'll be millionaires. Well, when Del Boy became a millionaire, what did he say? This time next year we'll be billionaires. And then they lost it all. Should never have come back, but there you go. But compared to losing your soul, Jesus says. You see, Peter tries to give the alternative view, doesn't he? Peter's saying, no, don't go to the cross, Jesus. No. Don't suffer and die, Jesus. No. That's worldly thinking, Jesus says. See, what's the alternative view? Satan comes with the alternative view. When Jesus is in the wilderness being tempted, here comes the alternative view. Jesus, you can have the whole world. Jump off the temple, the angels will catch you. Worship me, bow down, I'll give you all of this. You can have it all, promises Satan. Now, of course, it's not Satan's to give, is it? But the promise is there, you can have the whole world if you bow down and worship me. Why is that tempting for Jesus? And it is tempting, otherwise it's not a temptation. If something doesn't tempt you, it's not a temptation, is it? It is really tempting for Jesus. Why? He can have the world without the cross. That's why it's tempting. Of course it's tempting. Have all the glory of the whole world without the cross. That is satanic thinking. That's worldly thinking. Just don't go to the cross. But the same temptation comes to you and me. Don't go for the cross. Don't go for suffering. Worldly thinking. That's the alternative view. Well, the third and final thing we see is, will it be worth it? Will it be worth it? The cost is huge, everything. The alternative, what is it? Lose your soul. Gain the world? We used to have a phrase, and we easy come, easy go. Something is easy, well, you just get rid of it. We live in a kind of a disposable world now, don't we? Everything is disposable. Used to be an advert on TV for beer, I think. Reassuringly expensive. Trying to convey the message. The price is worth paying because it's so expensive. It's so well made. If somebody offered you a Rolls Royce for £500, you'd think there's either something wrong with him, he's stolen it, or there's something wrong with the car. Why? Because it's something that's valuable. It's something that's well made. It's put together. It's supposed to be expensive. And so if it's not, well, I'm wary of that. You don't get anything for free, we're told. And they're right. We're thinking about eternal salvation here tonight. We're thinking about the story of salvation, of God's story, of everything in history revolving around Jesus Christ, his life and his death on the cross and then his resurrection. It is everything. And we'll see when history is concluded that the history of the Church of Jesus Christ is history. That is it. It's everything. And the cost that Jesus pays is reassuringly expensive. It is everything. It is enormous. Just picture him in Gethsemane. Picture him there praying for strength. That's what he's praying for. He knows what's coming. And as he contemplates it, he wants to have the strength to be able to keep going, basically, in the agony. Why? Well, because there is agony in knowing what's to come. There's the agony physically of the flogging. There's the agony of the physical death on the cross, which is excruciating for hour after hour. There's the agony of the humiliation, of the nakedness and the shame and the crowds and everything else. There's the agony of bearing other people's sins. There's the agony of bearing the wrath of God, which is deserved by you and me and is taken by him. And yet, it's the way of the cross for Jesus. And he willingly goes for us. He willingly goes through this for you. Why? Because of great love. Greater love has no one than this, as he lays down his life for you. He goes to the cross, and I dare to ask tonight, is it worth it? And the answer is, of course it's worth it. Because you see, as Jesus dies on the cross, it's not just him who's dying. As he goes to the cross, he dies and puts us to death with him. As his followers, we go to the cross with him. We die with him. It's the old illustration, isn't it, of the slave that is there, who has a cruel master. A cruel master beats this slave mercilessly every day. Just gets beaten down. 10 things in particular he's beaten with. And then the king comes. And the king sees this slave. And the king goes to set him free. How does he do it? He kills him. He puts him to death. And the slave is dead. What happens? That cruel slave master comes with his 10 sticks to beat him with, and he sees he's dead. He can't beat him any longer. And so he goes. What happens? The king comes back. And he brings the slave back to life. Friends, that's what Jesus does on the cross. He puts us to death with him. We can't be beaten anymore by the law of God. It can't flog us. Satan can't come and assail us anymore. Why? Because as Christ died on the cross, you and I died on the cross. We are dead to sin. But Christ has made us alive. That's the way of the cross. He makes us alive with him. Jesus says, verse 26, verse 25, whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What's Jesus doing? He brings us life, doesn't he? And it's glorious. We see that here. Verse 27, the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they've done. There's going to be a glorious day, we sang of it earlier, that glorious day when Christ will return. The glory comes, but it comes after the cross. There is suffering and death and resurrection glory, but suffering and death has to come first, and it has to come for us as well. That's the way of the cross. That's the power of God. That's the wisdom of God. It's suffering, cross, resurrection, ascension, glory. And as we follow Jesus Christ, he changes everything. God flips everything. We go the way of the cross. The problem is, with our sinful nature, we don't want to go that way. We resist him. We take our eyes off him. We become like Peter and think in a worldly way. We want to save our lives. We want to save other people's lives. we don't trust Jesus as we should. Jesus has gone through the curtain, hasn't he? He has suffered. He has died for us. And in Christ he has made us alive with him as we have died with him. So the call tonight, are you following Jesus? Are you willing to pay that cost? Are you willing to follow in the way of the cross? It changes everything.